Hello, everybody. Once again, I'm Liam Crafton Jr., aka Zorvachon Let's Saying Guru. We have Mars Video Cat here, and today I would like to do a thoughts and discussion about something that, like normal for me, usually comes up while I'm either game mastering or playing in a game. And it happened two days ago, today being Saturday. On Thursday, when we were wrapping up a Torg Eternity Mega Adventure, the Rorsch Mega Adventure. I'll try not to do any spoilers for that, but basically, the 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 thoughts and discussion for today are not specific about a Rorsch Mega Adventure, but about what happened at the end and how you can apply that to games, how you may not wish to, other alternatives, etc. So basically, I am in various games, game mastering and playing, and on Thursday nights we have a table that it's a temporary table. It is a table that we were just, okay, let's do Thursday nights until we finish this mega adventure, and then it's through to organized play, which sometimes they'll have just acts, say a Delphi mission, that's an act, you just do the act, it takes one day, and then the characters players and characters can break apart. You might meet each other in other games, both as players and as characters, etc. But this was a temporary type basis. And we've had quite a few weeks for various reasons, which happens with real life, that people weren't able to make it. And there was kind of a blanket rule of if one person can't make it, we'll push on. If two or more people can't make it, then we cancel. And it extended our gaming session, or the adventure, for probably close to a month to 2 months, a month and a half. I'll say. So we were on what would be the last night, the last session, and we get to the end, and we're up against the biggest, baddest, endest person, monster, whatever, the BBEG of the entire adventure. So when we get to this point, we are getting through the fight. It's somewhat hard. We're persevering though, and we get to a point where it's like it's going to wrap up soon, but we're already, say, 10-15 minutes past time. And the game master assesses the situation and basically says, okay, I can see your resources that you have, and I do not see a way that this enemy, this threat, will be able to take anybody out. Not even just taking out the party, but the loss of life is extremely thin in this case because of your resources. In Torg, that is not just their wounds and shock hit point equivalent, but there's also cards and possibilities that you can spend as well. So basically, he says, would anybody be opposed to just finishing up, to just say that you won and this is what happens, and we get into the aftermath and the log report, etc. And nobody had a problem, and I think that is fine in those types of situations. Sometimes that happens when you spend a lot of time at the beginning planning, figuring out stuff, and then your game session starts running long. It's also a very different beast now that the people that I game with are usually around my age, give or take 10 years. But we're in places where we have duty, we have work, our bodies just don't function at peak performance like they did when we were in our 20s. When I was in college, we would 20 minutes over, what's that? We'd stay up until 7 o'clock, meet the sun as it was rising as we were finishing up a game, stuff like that. Also, depending on the people in your table, is perfectly fine. So what I started thinking about is this whole call it. Should we call it? Um, and why I've used it in my own Torg Eternity games. I've had seen and been in other playing Torg Eternity and even D&D Fifth Edition and such like that, where the game master just realizes that there's kind of I don't want to say no point, but the villains, the threats don't have much to put a permanent mark on the party, and just says, "Is it all right And usually, if somebody really wants to figure out who makes that last blow, who can put the little tick mark, on their kill count or whatever, then press on. But for the most part, everybody usually is okay with ending that scene, whether it's a minor big bad or the biggest baddest at the end. So it got me thinking why in Torg Eternity, D&D 5th edition, stuff like that, I've seen it and I've done it myself, but in older style, and especially when I was younger, that never really brought up. We would go down to the last minion if the party would take out the main threat, unless the game master figured that they might surrender. But there was no just let's call it. There was an in-game reason for the battle to stop, and that could be villains running away or threats running away, surrender, etc. But it wasn't just a hey, we've got to a point. So I started thinking, why in certain cases is this not something that I do, but in other cases it is something that I do. And I kind of got a point down that it kind of is the two philosophies out there, or the extremes, because there are games and such and systems that are in the middle, but it's a combination, and it kind of leads to these. You have those systems, and I've talked about this before, of combat being battle versus sport. Also, it's resource replenishment or resource regeneration. So older games had combat as battle. There was no trying to figure out an even opponent or group of opponents to attack your party. It was basically here's the opponents. They might be higher than you, they might be lower level than you, they might be equivalent to you, but you might not always know that. And people would come up with plans and spend lots of game time figuring up those plans to take advantage, to get advantage over. And I'm not talking about adding another D20, I'm talking about flooding layers, poisoning wells, whatever needed to be done to give you an advantage, setting up Windcast River of Lavas and things like that. So, in combat as battle, that is something that can swing wildly. When you have combat as sport, though, which would be a lot of games, more recent editions of Dungeons and Dragons, 4th, 5th edition, probably Pathfinder 3.x with their challenge ratings. Then you would also have the Torg Eternities, where is things like this many two times per storm night. So you might have these shock troopers and say, okay, there's two shocker troopers per storm night, or four per storm night, or something like that. So it adjusts on a scale depending on who the party is. And it also is reminiscent of sports, of combat as sport, where you might have two Little League baseball teams, and one of them, it just starts scoring a lot higher than another team, and they'll just call it. They'll just say there's, we don't want to. I mean, it's bad enough that it's 19 to 2. We don't need it to be 99 to 2. You don't need to beat us that bad. So both sides agree, call it, and then, you move on from there. So I want to say I don't think either one is wrong. I just think you need to understand your players. Do the players really want to do this extending time, or do they need to go to sleep because they got to work tomorrow, or are they ones that they want to find out who killed the last blow? And you might have to do some balancing there if you have various players within your party that want different things. The one guy wants to go to sleep or needs to, maybe not once, needs to go to sleep because works early the next morning, and the other one wants to extend it to get that last blow in. So, also to go along with this is resource replenishment or resource regeneration. In newer games, and I'll just use the ones that I have been using, they have resources that replenish rather quickly. So in Torg Eternity, you have shock that you recover with after a few moments of non-activity. You have wounds that immediately after battle you can do a first aid check normally, get rid of a wound. You have priests that can heal. And sometimes between acts and between scenes, there might be enough time where Game Master just say, by the time you get to the next scene, all your heals or all your wounds are healed. All your heals are wounded. um, and games like D&D fourth and fifth edition both have a short rest and, depending on the edition, an extended or long rest mechanic. Where short rest you can spend recovery or healing surges and or healing surges or hit dice depending on which edition. And after long rests, you are completely healed. Your hit points go back to max. It doesn't matter that you got down to one hit point. They're all healed back because it's trying to move you along in a story, which is while modules and stuff were in place in older games, they weren't a lot of long adventures where the whole book was one adventure. A lot of time it was an area that explained that area, explained that dungeon, and then how the party did it would be different depending on the party, instead of more current things like adventure paths, mega adventures, stuff like this, which will have there might be little sandboxy type areas, but it's basically a plot to get you from A to Z. So you want to push on, you want to push on. Older games don't necessarily have that. Old D&D, Palladium First Edition, things like that have you heal like one hit point a day, maybe 2 hit points a day in Palladium, and then after the first 2 days, as long as you're not fighting again, then you can heal a couple more points. And that would slow down. So anything that affected you now might still be affecting you in the days and weeks to come. Not just you wake up in the morning and you're refreshed, or you take a long or extended rest and you're refreshed. You're still down those hit points. And also there's a shift, and I know a lot of people will say counting arrows isn't fun. And when you are in a game like Torg that's cinematic, I won't say that it's not fun, but I don't see it fitting that the reason of playing Torg Eternity. Torg Eternity is set up like a TV series or a movie. You will fade to black. The heroes don't have to worry about counting ammo unless it's necessary. You can watch action movies and they don't worry about counting bullets until click, it happens. And that's what things like setback and Torg are used for, to say, okay, you're on your last magazine, you're on your last bullet. Oh, you ran out. To add that. Otherwise, it's not really necessary to count. In the other games, the combat as battle, the old school Palladium First Edition, D&D first, AD&D First Second Edition, BECMI, BX, things like that, you needed to count your arrows because those were the resource management of that time. You didn't have daily powers that you take an extended rest in fourth edition and that you're able to use it again. You didn't have encounter powers where you could take a short rest and then be able to use it again. You basically, those arrows were your resources. Those were the things that when you got low enough, maybe you had to go back to town to buy new ones. Maybe you had to spend time and resources to, cut down tree limbs, find out which ones could be used for arrows, and make your own arrows, things like that. Same thing with figuring out how many rations you're carrying was important in older games, because part of that wasn't necessarily a big overarching storyline. It was a getting deeper and deeper, and you had to clear out. You'd use resources. You'd go back to town. You'd rest. You would heal up. You would buy your resources back, spend money, hopefully that you were able to acquire during your dungeon delve, and then you would go back, or you would go to another one. But there's a whole different type of mechanic and a whole different feel. So while, yes, there are people out there who think that it's no fun to count arrows, In other games, that is your resources. You don't have your inspirations or anything to kind of limit the characters and figure out when to rest. The purpose of the game was different, the setting was different, and calling it in those types of games has more impact. When you call it in a game that in a couple of hours you're going to refresh and you'll be as good as new is very different than calling it in a game where those extra rounds would have depleted resources that would take days and weeks to replenish. What the mechanism that you use in those games, though, is you use the morale rules that were in older D&D editions. You determine that at a point the enemies do realize that they're not probably not going to make it, and you roll that morale. Maybe all of them run away, maybe some of them run away, but it's an in-game mechanic. It's a storytelling also mechanic. Instead of just saying, okay, you win and do it, you're having your your opponents flee, you're having them surrender in the rounds of the game, and it still will shorten it. It won't be just a boom, we're stopping right here, unless they all run away and the players characters don't chase them. But you will get attrition. You will get where the opponents get smaller and smaller, or the group of them will get fewer and fewer, and then it makes it so that the wrap up happens quicker than if you just have every single one fight to the death. But sometimes maybe they will. Maybe there is a reason. And in a lot of those older games, and even in new games, it will say so and so will fight to the death because their boss, they're afraid of them more than the heroes, things like that. But that is a different type of game, a different reason to play the game. So basically, that's a lot of what I wanted to say. I just wanted to talk about how calling it is perfectly valid if everybody agrees, don't have any problem with it, but how it is more set to games that have that very quick turnover of resources and replenishment of resources. Very good for that combat as sport type system where you can clearly see that the enemy is going to lose because you have this equal battle or this equivalent battle, and then it's tilted too far to recover from. While in combat as battle, then there could be a serious imbalance of power, and maybe the party has to flee. Maybe the enemy will flee because they realize that they're level 1 and the party's level 5, and things like that. So basically, it's just, yes, calling it is not a bad thing, but also think about the games that you're doing. Maybe use morale. Look at the older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, the BECMI, the BX, the AD&D first, second edition, things like that. Also, look, morale was in Warhammer fantasy roleplay, where and in the fantasy battles where entire units of soldiers could go off. Try to figure out that, and I use Palladium First Edition, a rewrite of it. Palladium never really had a morale. I do kind of an intelligence check. If it starts getting bad, I'll roll a few d6s against intelligence. If it's under the intelligence, the creature, monster, threat, whatever, will realize that its life is in danger or the situation has turned, and then it will flee. So you can bring in those mechanics even if it's not part of the system you're using, but if it is more of that combat as battle, resource replenishment takes much longer because that arrow you spend, that hit point that of damage you've taken, that has more long-term consequences than you rest and you get it back. So having said that, hopefully you gain something, some insight into how you might which side of the scale or the ruler, the line that you might direct your games to. So once again, I'm Lee McCracken Jr., aka Zorval Chan Less Than Guru, and until next time, I will catch you later.